It was April of 2008. I was 20 and living in Denver for a year-long work contract with a nonprofit in Boulder. My girlfriend, now wife, and my best friend Tim drove to Colorado from our home state to visit me for my 21st birthday. The nonprofit I was working for housed their workers in dorm rooms, and drinking was not allowed on site, nor were visitors allowed to stay overnight. So I booked a hotel room in downtown Denver for the weekend where we could drink in honor of my 21st. The hotel was big, very nice, and in a safe central area of the city. So nice, in fact, that it was the same hotel that most of the politicians would later stay at during the DNC convention of 2008 that took place in Denver later that summer. My wife and Tim arrived Saturday morning, and we all met up at the hotel. The day was fantastic. We drank across the city most of the day. By about 1 a.m. we got back to the hotel. The room was typical with 2 queen beds. Bed number 1 was close to a big window looking out across the city. Bed number 2 was pushed against the wall with a door that opened to the bathroom. You couldn't see the door or entryway to our room unless you were at the foot of bed number 1. We drank more and chatted in the room until about 4 a.m. My wife was laying at the head of bed number 2 flipping through the TV. Tim and I were seated at the foot of the bed number 1 staring out the window as we talked. As we talked, I heard some movement and the sound of a door opening. Without looking away from the window, I assumed it was my wife getting up to use the bathroom. A few minutes passed by and I thought I heard the movement again, so I finally turned around to look. I saw my wife still lounging in bed number 2 as she had been. "Did you get up a few minutes ago and use the bathroom?" I asked her. "No," she replied. "I thought I heard a door," I said back to her with her just looking confused back at me. "Yeah, I thought I heard that too," Tim said, breaking his own gaze from the window. It was then that I started to run cold and sobered up pretty quick. Very softly I heard Tim say, "I think there is someone in our room." I lurched forward from the foot of the bed to look into the pitch-black entryway. I could barely make it out, and I wanted to believe I wasn't seeing it. But there was a man dressed in all black with a black baseball cap pressed into the 90-degree corner of the entryway, where the room door and the wall met. Absolute silence fell on the room, and it felt like hours passed by as I started to panic in my mind, like no way I ever had before in my entire life. We all knew we weren't alone and hadn't been for a while, and he knew we spotted him. Eventually, Tim got the courage to meekly speak in the direction of the entryway and said, "Hey man, is there something we can help you out with?" Another period of silence that felt like an eternity went by. He slumped off the edge of the wall a little into the light and made eye contact with Tim and I. We all just stared at each other. Then eventually he spoke up and said, "Is this room 1709? "No man, it's not," Tim said, stroking his beard nervously. He stared at us for a while longer, raising his eyebrows and shaking his head. He then turned around and left. We then erupted into a million curse words and paced around the room. I called the front desk. They told me that he was drunk and they found him in the stairwell, but directed him back to the right room. Minutes later, Tim called the front desk and they told him he was not a guest. He was apprehended in the stairwell and taken into the police custody. Then, a while later, they told my wife he disappeared and they had no idea who he was or what he was doing. They told her there wasn't even a room 1709 in the hotel. We got 3 different stories. We still have no idea what that was all about, or how he managed to get a key card to our room. We were sure the door was closed. It was easily the most terrifying moment of my life. Always use the latch in hotel rooms. We got the stay refunded and about $200 in credit for food from the hotel. We should have sued, but we were young and dumb. This happened to me a few years ago, probably back in 2017 when I was 14. I still think about this encounter almost every day. My dad lives near a small lake in Wisconsin. There are only about 100 people who live in the neighborhood. My brother and I spent every other weekend up there, so we knew pretty much everyone. My dad's house was the second house from the top of this large hill. At the very top is a gas station and the diner where I would work over the summer. At the bottom of the hill was the lake and a small beach. That morning I was waitressing at the diner, and at the end of my shift I bought a slushie from the gas station and was planning on going down to the beach for the afternoon. Parked outside the diner was a gorgeous teal vintage car. I'm not sure what brand, I'm not good with that stuff, but it seemed to be from the 60s and it caught my eye. There was an older man in the driver's seat and his wife in the passenger seat. They had their windows up and I wasn't too close, so I didn't get a great look at them, but I did notice they were looking at me. I didn't think anything of it and started walking home. On my walk home, I remember wondering where they could be from. We don't get many tourists, and I would have remembered if someone drove a car like that. The diner was off of a pretty quiet highway, and it was rarely used by out-of-towners, but I assumed they were just driving through. My younger brother and I went to the beach that afternoon and hung out for a few hours. When we decided to head home, I packed up my stuff probably a minute before he did, and started walking home before him. On the walk up the hill, there was probably half a city block's distance between us. He could clearly see me, but we were too far to talk. I heard a car coming towards me and looked back and moved to the side of the street. It's the car I saw earlier at the diner. They slow down as they approach me and I start to get nervous. The woman in the passenger seat rolls down her window and I nearly soiled my pants. They both seem to be wearing hyper-realistic latex face masks. There seemed to be no beginning and no end to the mask. There weren't noticeable holes for eyes, yet their eyes definitely seemed real. And there was no seam at the edge of the neck. If they were wearing masks, they were some of the best masks I've ever seen, and must have cost a fortune. But it definitely wasn't their skin. There's no way. Something about them was so off. The woman asked me for directions to a highway I've never heard of. I didn't drive yet, so this in itself wasn't weird, but I pointed them to the highway by the diner that leads out of town. They thanked me, rolled up the window, and drove away. I ran to my brother and told him what happened, and he said they looked pretty normal when they drove past him, but they looked normal to me that morning as well. The masks were too good. You had to be close enough to notice how strange they looked. There was just something so unsettling about them. They didn't really do anything odd except asking a girl who was clearly too young to drive for directions. But it was a very small community, and I might have been the first person they had seen in hours. It was just the way they looked. I'd never seen anything like it, and I haven't seen anything like it since then. I mentioned it to my dad when I got home, but he didn't have much to say about it. I still feel deeply unnerved when I think about it, more than 6 years later. I don't believe in much of the paranormal stuff, and I do think they were human. But why the masks? What were they doing there? And why ask a child who was obviously too young to drive for directions to a highway? Has anyone ever experienced something like this before? So one day, I had a creepy encounter with my family doctor. I am a 35-year-old woman now, but this encounter happened when I was around 14 or 15 years old, so about 20 years ago now. But the memory is as fresh and as vivid as though it happened yesterday. I haven't even thought of this story in many years until I came across this Reddit channel. And after reading some of the other stories, my own personal memory of this story came flooding back. So anyway, everyone in my family, and some still do, used to see this one family doctor for many, many years for all our medical needs. We'll call him Dr. D. We'd been seeing this doctor for so long. He was even there at the delivery of my birth, where he held me in his arms when I was just a newborn baby. From then on, I would see him for everything. Every time I got sick, for all my immunizations, etc., etc. So it was only natural that I would go see him the day I needed to get my first pap smear I'd ever done. I had just started becoming sexually active for the first time with my very first boyfriend at this stage, and I had learned in school sex ed as well as from other various sources that once a female starts becoming sexually active, they need to also start getting pap smear tests done. For those who may not know, a pap smear or pap test is a test or procedure done by your doctor to check for cervical cancer in women. The test is not painful in any way, but can feel a little bit strange, uncomfortable, and invasive as it requires a swab being inserted inside to collect the sample. Other than that, it is a very quick procedure that altogether takes no longer than a minute or two from start to finish. This last point is important to take note of for later in the story. So it's important to note here that even before arriving to my appointment, I was already in a state of feeling a little bit freaked out and uncomfortable with the whole situation because at 14 I was a lot like most other young girls my age, where I felt very awkward about my growing body, had poor self-image, and would often wear baggy clothes to hide any signs of my womanhood from the outside world. So the idea that I had to do a test that required I strip from the waist down, sit on a bench with my legs wide open, only to have some random grown-up come right up in there and fiddle around down there, sounded to me like the last thing in the world I wanted to do, and was feeling already very embarrassed about it. And even though I was told by many different people that if I wanted, and if it made me more comfortable, I could request for a female doctor to do the test, for some reason I had turned that option down, something I would regret later. I guess I just thought in my head it's okay. I'll just see Dr. D like I always do. I mean, he is my doctor, I've known him for years, so it's only natural I continue to see him and treat this appointment like any other appointment. And I guess I just managed to convince myself to stop being so silly. Everything was fine. And besides, he is a professional doctor who will approach this situation with professionalism, and will conduct himself in a way that will not make me feel any more awkward than I already do. How wrong I was. So Dr. D tells me to take off everything from the waist down, to lie on the bed, put the white sheet over my lap, and wait for him while he gets everything together. I do this, feeling a bit red in the face, but I do as he asks, hurriedly, as I am impatient to get this over and done with quickly. When he does come around the curtain, he sits down on a low stool right between my legs, whips off the sheet, and looks up at me with a big smile on his face. He then proceeds to have a conversation with me about something. Honestly, I don't remember what about. However, what I do remember was that it wasn't at all relevant to the situation at hand or anything to do with the test or any medical information in relation to me whatsoever. I just remember that he had chosen that moment to talk about other trivial things like, "So how's the family going?" or "What year are you at in school now?" and things of that nature. Honestly, I wouldn't have been listening to anything he was saying at the time, as all I would have been thinking about is me screaming at him to hurry up and get on with it, and that I do not feel like having a chit-chat with him while my private bits are in his face. But if I had thought for a second that this ill-timed catch-up session would be the most uncomfortable thing to happen in that moment, I would be wrong. As he is chit-chatting away to me, as well as going back and forth between making eye contact with me and flashing me a wide smile to looking down at my private areas with a deep, penetrating gaze. He all of a sudden wraps his hand right around my inner thigh, closest to where my knee is. He does so just gently, almost like he's just resting his hand there for a second, but it makes me do a little jump. He doesn't seem to notice though and continues talking. And as he's talking, I realize that he slowly started to circle his thumb on my inner thigh in a slow, gentle caress. Immediately, alarm bells start ringing in my head. I'm thinking to myself, what is he doing? The action was almost like he was trying to soothe or relax me in some way, sort of like how a mother might use her hand to do small circular motions on her crying child's back in an attempt to soothe. But why? Was I maybe being outwardly obvious about how uncomfortable I was with the situation, despite my best efforts to not let it show? And even if it was obvious to Dr. D, is it normal for a doctor to do this soothing action on a patient? And on top of this, how much longer is this whole damn thing gonna take anyway? I thought this was meant to be a real quick procedure. That's when deep down I started to realize that something was very wrong with the situation, or that I started to sense his intentions weren't good or appropriate at all, because he started to move his hand slowly up my inner thigh, towards my private area, still caressing me with his thumb, and still gazing directly at me as he went. It's when his hand reached its destination, and not because he was about to do the swab at that stage, but to just continue to caress me, that my legs started to shake uncontrollably, not for any other reason than the fact that I was scared, and I just couldn't stop myself from shaking in fear. Then 2 seconds later, the tears started to slowly form and roll down my face as I let out a little whimpering sound. Of course, Dr. D immediately noticed this, but doesn't at all stop or spring back like you would hope he would do in that situation, as though he might be realizing what he's doing is wrong and decides to stop what he's doing. No, he just continues to do it more intensely and says to me, "Honey, you're shaking. What's wrong? Why are you feeling so nervous? Don't be nervous, honey. Just try to relax. Everything's fine." And he just continues to caress me. It's almost like he believes his words and actions are actually helping me to relax, when quite clearly, it's doing the complete opposite. But for some reason, I don't say a word. I don't tell him to stop or back off. I don't move a muscle, other than the uncontrollable shake that I can't help. What's even more baffling about my behavior and reaction at this point is I even quickly try to wipe away and hide my tears from him so he doesn't see it. Because for some reason in that moment, I feel bad for him, because I'm worried my tears and distress might be making his job harder in some way by me being a challenging or uncooperative patient. I can't explain why I thought or reacted this way other than the fact that I was just a young 14-year-old girl who was freaking out and just didn't know what to do in an unsettling situation, and especially because it was happening with someone I knew my entire life and had looked up to and trusted for a very long time. Anyway, it relieves me to say that he eventually did perform the test, and that this story doesn't end with any further graphic details of some sort of sexual assault or anything of that nature. He did, however, act completely oblivious to my distress throughout the whole thing, acted the whole way through like he wasn't doing anything wrong, and that everything was normal. Oh, and remember how earlier I mentioned this test should only take usually 1 or 2 minutes at most to complete. I was on that table for 15 minutes with him, which might not be a long amount of time, but to me it felt like years in that moment. Do you know what the worst part is? The moment I got home to my parents, I burst into tears, flung myself into their arms, and proceeded to tell them the entire story. As freaked out as I was, within seconds I started to feel better. Just knowing that I was back within the safety net of their presence, but also knowing that once I finished telling them what happened, that my parents would know what to do to fix the situation as well as offer me much needed comfort. But you know what? That's not what I got. What I got was being immediately thrusted out of their embrace and then straight away got the biggest telling off session of my life. They didn't believe a word I said. In fact, they got so angry at me for being a troublemaker and making up stories about their trusted family doctor who they have known for years and knew for a fact wouldn't ever do anything of what I was accusing him of. Then they told me to stop crying and immediately grounded me. I was in complete and utter shock, and to this day I'm still not sure which one is worse. My doctor doing what he did, or my own family's reaction to the situation. Both experiences ended up hurting me deeply, so nothing ever came of the situation. I had to bottle it up inside and bury it all away, and he got away with it. The only thing I had in my power to do was make the decision to never see him again, which I haven't to this day. There had been plenty of times where I had thought about reporting him to police, especially fearing for the well-being of any other women out there in his care. But after how my parents reacted, I convinced myself that the police probably wouldn't believe me either. If it came to me against him, I believed I would lose, so I stayed silent. I just truly hope that nothing awful has ever happened at his hands to anybody else after my experience.